Latvia's largest Soviet memorial has been destroyed on the orders of the National Parliament. A concrete obelisk rising nearly 80 meters into the sky formed the centerpiece of the monument. It commemorated the Red Army's victory over Nazi Germany in the Second World War. Its toppling is the latest example of an ongoing trend in the Baltic states and Eastern Europe, where relics of the Soviet Union are being removed. DW's Killian Beyer reports from Riga.
Meter upon meter of concrete steel crashing to the ground. The monument may have been destroyed, but it leaves a political divide in its wake.
I feel wonderful because I experienced the awakening of Latvian independence in the 1990s, and now it feels like this chapter's finally closed.
I feel pain and injustice. My grandparents died in the war. They defended the whole world from fascism.
Just a few months ago, Riga's Victory Park looked like this. It was the symbol of the Red Army's victory over Nazi Germany, a place for ethnic Russians to lay down flowers on Victory Day to commemorate their ancestors' sacrifices in the Second World War. But the war in Ukraine changed something. Around 1 in 4 people living in Latvia are of Russian descent. Many of them cherish their Soviet past. The majority of ethnic Latvians, however, see this monument as a symbol of Russian imperialism and are glad that it's gone.
Welcome to another episode of Actually Existing Socialism. It's your host, Tony. What you just heard is an August 2022 clip from the German news channel DW, talking about the destruction and removal of a Soviet monument commemorating the Soviet victory over the Nazis in World War II. A political action in which this episode will provide much more historical context than any English news coverage. Today, I'm joined by Comrade Iskolat, an active Latvian communist, to learn about the shrouded history of Latvia, which is part of the Soviet Union, officially known as the Latvian Soviet Socialist Republic, continuously from 1944 to 1990. In this first part, we'll be discussing the prehistory of the Socialist Republic by delving into the conditions of what would become Latvia in the early 20th century to the eventual socialist revolution in the early 1940s. Next episode, we'll be discussing from 1945 to the present in post-communist Latvia. When I say the history covered here from the communist point of view is almost impossible to find in English, I'm not exaggerating. I hope you find this discussion as informative and enlightening as I have. Iskolat can be found on Twitter at Iskolat, which is spelled Iskolat. More information, of course, can be found in the show notes regarding what you can do to help out the Latvian communist movement if you're so inclined, particularly in their efforts to get materials from the Baltic region translated into English for the first time. And as you know, this podcast is 100% listener funded and a solo production, so anything you can spare go a long way in having me continue this educational project. So if you do wish to contribute to the show, you can become a Patreon subscriber at patreon.com/AESthepodcast to gain access to a variety of bonus content, Actually Existing Socialism. So shout out to my patrons who've helped me thus far. If you're unable to contribute in that way, no problem. What you can do is you can help out by sharing this episode and by following us on Twitter at AESthepodcast. You can also subscribe to the show on your preferred podcast platform to get new episode notifications. Also, feel free to leave a review if you have the time, or even just a star rating. For this episode, I'd like to welcome Comrade Iskolat to the show. Thank you so much for being here to talk about Latvia.
Thank you for having me. So we have plenty of questions ready to go. And after that, if we have some time, I would gladly talk about modern issues and, for example, important topics such as Palestine. So we'll start with the historical background, so people who are not familiar with the Baltics and Eastern Europe in general could get up to speed. So let's start.
Yeah, for sure. That sounds good. So definitely, as we discussed before, I'm really hoping for this to kind of be like a Latvia 101 for English speakers. It's not a country that we hear really anything about when it comes to news, and we definitely don't hear much about its socialist period. In preparing for this episode, as I found the case to be for many Eastern Bloc countries, is that it's hard to find information in English that isn't blatantly anti-communist. You know, I was looking for videos to watch while I was doing something else on Latvia. It was essentially I can't remember the name of the foundation, but it was essentially a victims of communism kind of thing, talking about.
Oh yeah. I know. Yeah.
Yeah. So pretty much that's all that there is, besides just kind of general. Oh, Latvia is a country in Eastern Europe, and it has this amount of people that live in it, kind of thing, right? So hopefully this will be a good kind of intro on the socialist period to people who may have never even heard of the country. To kind of get us started here, of course, socialist countries emerged in the 20th century. What's very vital, of course, is the preconditions for the emergence of socialism in these countries. So could you kind of walk us through what the political and economic state of Latvia was going into the 20th century and even to the pre-World War I era?
Latvia, like the neighboring countries of Lithuania and Estonia, were part of the Russian Empire back then. These three countries were divided into several governorates. For Latvia, it was Livonia, it was Courland, and for Estonia, well, it was called the Estonian Governorate, and for Lithuania, it was Kaunas and Vilnius. So the countries did not exist back then as we know them. So obviously, they were ruled by an absolute monarchy from St. Petersburg. And just like the rest of Russia, the situation was very oppressive. In many cases, many regions were pretty backwards, but regions such as the Baltics were the exception because of their strategic locations. So the Industrial Revolution happened much, much quicker than elsewhere in Russia. So, for example, the serfdom was abolished 40 years earlier before the rest of the country. And soon, large inflows of capital followed. Large industries popped up in cities such as Riga, Tallinn, etc. And workers both from the rural part of the Baltics and other cities flowed in. From the very onset of the Industrial Revolution here in the Baltics, this region had a very, very strong and developed labor union. Obviously, abuse and labor exploitation was very, very widespread. People were living in tiny, cramped rooms and apartments, received very, very low pay, especially the women and the children. And of course, all the forms of protests and expression were banned, and people had to work for 12 to 14 hours a day. And by the end of the 19th century, various labor and Marxist and social democratic groups emerged in the Russian Empire. One of the first of them was the group called the Workers' Freedom, or the Workers' Will and the People's Will. So all these liberation movements popped up, and they then transformed into these organized political groups, and most notably the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party. It had several sections, and one of them was the Latvian section, and it was simply called the Latvian Social Democracy. So the repression went on for quite a while before it just exploded in 1905. So the revolution of 1905 is really famous. It was led both by the Social Democrats, which were basically communists, and various petty bourgeois and progressive democratic groups against the Tsarist government. So this revolution was brutally suppressed, especially in large cities such as St. Petersburg, Moscow, the Baltics, Poland, Finland. And in these industrial centers, it was really, really powerful. There were general strikes everywhere, workers protesting, not going to work, and the Tsarist authorities responded in the harshest kind possible. So the people were shot at. A lot of them were killed. After a couple of years, the Tsarists, after some cosmetic concessions, they managed to suppress it. And for example, here in the Baltics, there was a revolutionary group known as the Forest Brothers, not to be confused with the Nazis. Many revolutionaries retreated into the hinterland, into the forest, and continued their fight until 1907, 1908. The situation stabilized somewhat, and then World War I started after the imperialist contradictions reached their boiling point. Half of Latvia was occupied by the German Empire. The rest remained under Russian control. But by 1917, the February Revolution happened. The Tsar was deposed. The bourgeois, the capitalist provisional government was very unstable. And by October, November of 1917, as you all know, it was toppled during the October Revolution. The Socialist Revolution was extremely popular in the Baltics. the amount of Bolshevik delegates, the amount of Bolshevik councillors was actually huge in the politics. They were huge among the peasantry, among the working class, and among the soldiers. So in December of 1917, the Latvian soldiers, peasants, and workers formed provisional governments, provisional councils, provisional Soviets, and the Bolsheviks won an overwhelming majority, more than 90% of the vote. And by the end of 1917, Iskolat was formed. So hence my alias. So Iskolat means, from Russian, the Executive Committee of Latvian Soldiers, Peasants, and Workers' Councils. So they created their own governmental structures, and basically you can consider the December of 1917 to be the birth of the first Latvian state. It was a proletarian state. It was an infant state, but unfortunately did not exist for long, because after destroying the provisional government, the Soviet government could not continue this brutal and unjust imperialist warfare, so they immediately sued for peace. And after the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty, the Germans occupied Latvia for a long time, almost for an entire year, because these were the terms of the treaty. So the Germans and the Austrians occupy all of Ukraine, Belarus, the Baltics, and Finland. By the time the German Empire imploded itself and was engulfed in a revolution, several groups were fighting for legitimacy in Latvia. So obviously the revolutionary, the socialist government, the nationalist government that was a pro-German government, and a pro-British government. So it was a brutal civil war. Right now, it is incorrectly referred to as the War of Liberation, even though that's completely not true. Why do the capitalist ideologues call it the War of Liberation? Because essentially their own nationalist government managed to win the war. So after the German Empire imploded, the capitalists, the imperialists, could not enforce a direct rule over the Baltics. So what they came up instead is colonialism under the national flag. So essentially what they do, they just set up a bunch of puppet pro-imperialist governments in these regions, and they simply rule the place indirectly. Later, the Weimar Republic and the British supported these nationalist elements. And in November of 1918, in German-occupied Riga, the Nationalist Republic of Latvia was proclaimed. And since they were trying to attract a lot of peasantry and petty bourgeois elements to their side, in response, the communists formed the Latvian Socialist Soviet Republic in December of 1918 and January 1919. It then followed a brutal civil war. At first, the Socialist Republic of Latvia managed to almost liberate the entire territory, except for a couple of cities. But then the German reserves, the so-called Steel Division, arrived, and with the help of the Estonian nationalists and German imperialists, the Latvian nationalists managed to push back the socialists. They captured Riga. There was brutal white terror. Thousands of people were killed. They were simply picked off the streets and then shot. So, like in Finland, the white terror was really brutal. And by 1920, unfortunately, the Latvian Socialist Soviet Republic was dissolved. The Communist Party was immediately banned by the nationalists, and it had to continue the struggle underground. So this is the basic overview of pre-World War I and World War I history of Latvia. It's really, really packed because a lot of things happen here because we're involved in a world war. Then we'll move on to the interwar period.
Yeah, sure. So before we move on, I just want to say thanks for kind of laying out that outline for us of this period. Very complex period. A lot of things are going on. But I think that was an excellent summary. I think what gets forgotten is, when it comes to the October Revolution, of course, the focus is often on Russia and what's going on there, and Moscow and in the surrounding places. But people sometimes forget that it was a Russian Empire, which expanded quite extensively across parts of Eastern Europe and Asia as well. That the same things happened in these so-called periphery countries like Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, as was happening in so-called central parts of Russia. And even the Civil War aspect happening as well. The colonial interventions from Britain, from Germany, as happened in Russia. Again, these are also happening in these periphery areas. So it's very important to know. Getting into this period after World War I and in between World War I and World War II, the interwar period, what was the government type then? What did it look like? Was it a liberal democracy? Was it fascist dictatorship? What kind of filled in the gap before the communists again took power in the 40s?
In the 1920s, the Latvian bourgeois, that is, the capitalist government, tried to style itself as this liberal democracy, even though it was far, far from the truth. Because almost immediately after winning the civil war against the Socialist Republic, the nationalists immediately banned the Communist Party in 1920. And until 1923, the communists, the revolutionaries, and labor union activists were tried under the military tribunals. Even though the war had ended, they were still tried under this military court, and several people were sentenced to death. And they kept carrying out these death sentences until 1923. The Latvian, the workers of Latvia, the Latvian working people, did not give up, obviously, because essentially the reimposing of the capitalist order meant that there was horrific exploitation going on, and you need to add the destruction caused by the war, because a lot of people were evacuated from Latvia when the World War broke out. Many of them returned. Some of them stayed behind in Siberia. That's why you actually have Latvian diaspora in Siberia to this day. So the country was ruined. Because of that, the reconstruction progress was very, very slow. And people protested and they organized strikes a lot. And because of that, the government essentially tried to outlaw all strike activity. And they also banned the International Labor Day, the May 1st. And every time the workers tried to organize a strike, the secret police, the undercover cops, and the regular military would either mass arrest the organizers or straight up open fire. It was very brutal. And because of this repression, you could consider it as sort of a closeted fascist regime in this regard. So in the 1920s and late 1920s, the situation stabilized somewhat because of the roaring stock market. But then the Great Depression happened, a major economic crisis. And since the post-war Latvia and the rest of the Baltics became very, very export-oriented, most of the industry was destroyed or lost. So instead, the nationalists focused on export-oriented agriculture and light industries, textile. And labor abuse was very prolific. After the Great Depression, the government repression intensified. And there was a coup attempt, a fascist coup attempt, but with the help of the socialist opposition, it was prevented. Then the general elections came, and a few communist delegates were elected. So the Communist Party was banned, but these delegates were they were independent on paper. So they formed their own workers' bloc. And after some time in the early 1940s, all these delegates were simply arrested, thrown into prison. And in 1934, a fascist coup happened. It was masterminded by the same prime minister, Kārlis Ulmanis, who was leading the nationalists during the Civil War. And since he wanted to suppress the socialist movement for good, he masterminded a fascist coup. Latvia, along with Estonia and Lithuania, became a cookie-cutter fascist tyranny. So they outlawed every single party that opposed the government. They set up concentration camps where they put political opponents into these camps. Essentially, they gave unlimited power to the industrialists and foreign enterprises, foreign banks, foreign credit unions, etc. And all trade union activities, all protests, and all strikes were completely banned. The labor movement was pushed completely underground. So the labor activists, the communists, the socialists, they published their newspapers underground. They tried to organize themselves underground. They tried to agitate and educate and organize the workers underground. For some time, the situation appeared to be stable to the fascists, but then World War II broke out. So since the Baltics were export-oriented, their money supply immediately plummeted. So all exports stopped in an instant because of the war, because of all this disruption, and because Germany and Britain were not buying anymore. So since they were already fighting each other. And because of that, the economies of the Baltics functionally collapsed. It was so bad that the factories and all these large farm fields introduced 4 or 3 day work weeks because there was nothing to sell. Basically, a lot of people became jobless overnight. So the unemployment was more than 20% of the working population. It was huge. Tens of thousands of people were immediately out of work. And those who still had work, they could only work for like 3 hours a day and for 3 days a week and for a few hours a day, and they were paid appropriately. So they were not paid at all. By 1939 and 1940, the situation became critical. The Soviet Union, essentially, they told these fascist Baltic states, so you have to stop abusing the workers, you have to stop mistreating the workers, and you have to sign non-aggression pact with us so that the Baltics will not get taken over by the Nazis. The Baltic fascists were forced to do that. They were forced to sign these treaties, and in exchange, the Soviet Union signed several trade agreements with the Baltics. So various tariff-free trade agreements were signed, and the economic situation stabilized somewhat. But by the 1940s, the strike movement, the protest movement, the revolutionary movement picked up again. And by the summer of 1940, the general strike was declared. So people took it to the streets, and they blocked all major factories and major roadways, and they demanded the fascist government to resign. The fascist governments in the Baltics tried to counteract it with their troops, but they were blocked because the protesters took over all major roadways, and the armies declared their neutrality. So essentially, the military high command betrayed the government and said they wouldn't do anything. And in the end, the governments in all three Baltic republics were forced to resign, and in Lithuania, they straight up fled to Germany. The protesters demanded a new government and the new general elections. The Soviet Union said that a new Soviet-friendly government should be reinstated. The general elections happened. The communists win in an overwhelming majority. All political prisoners, all concentration camp inmates were released. And then the new Popular Front governments were created from progressive intellectuals, from social democrats, from socialists, from the communists, etc. And since the Nazis already took over France, by that point, they just completely annihilated Allied troops in France, in the Benelux. The new progressive governments feared that Germany would try to invade the Baltics next. So they appealed to the Soviet Union and asked if they could join as constituent Soviet republics. The Soviet Union said yes. And by August, the Baltic republics became socialist. So that's how it happened. It was a very complex process. And the most important thing is that the nationalists like to gloss over all of these details. The labor movement, the fascist dictatorships, all of this, they just ignore it. They simply straight up tell you that the Soviet Union invaded the Baltics. They destroyed everything. They slaughtered everyone. They repressed everyone. And they took over completely by force, which is not true. And even if you do a little bit of digging, the situation becomes much, much clearer. So essentially, the Baltic nationalists were not expecting to get overthrown. They were not expecting that at all. And because of that, they hold a massive grudge, and they're just trying to twist all this historical data to suit their narrative. But we will talk about that later in a bit. So that's how the June revolutions happened in the Baltics, and that's how the socialist republics were reestablished in the Baltic region, including Latvia.
Wow, no, that was an incredibly thorough explanation of the process of it joining the Soviet Union. Again, I guess you could say. My question now is, from what I understand, of course, there was the Molotov-Ribbentrop, non-aggression pact between the Soviet Union and Germany in 1939. And I've had Michael J. Carley join the show to really dispel some myths regarding that. So I recommend people check that out. But did Latvia figure into that agreement at all? Or am I misunderstanding that history?
So generally, the Baltics were not clued in. The thing is that the Baltics were very reactionary and Germany-oriented before World War II. So since they were propped up by the German imperialist capital and the British imperialist capital, they essentially looked at themselves as basically extension of the Central European powers of Germany, of Austria, etc. The Baltics signed separate non-aggression pacts with Germany, which were undoubtedly directed against the Soviet Union. And since the Baltic nationalist governments were previously fighting the socialist governments of the Baltics and Soviet Russia, they were deeply hostile to it. They feared that the socialist revolution could happen. So they tried to get themselves closer to Germany in order to protect themselves from this possibility. And, basically what the Soviet Union did, I don't know if it was mentioned or not, The Soviet Union, from the early 1940s, warned about the growth of fascism, and it tried to form several collective security agreements with France, with Britain, and Poland in order to protect other countries from German fascist expansion. Protecting Austria, Czechoslovakia, preventing the fascist takeover of Spain, etc. But all of these proposals were completely rebuffed. So the Litvinov Doctrine. So Litvinov, the Soviet foreign minister, proposed a collective security agreement, which is very similar to the UN, that was formed only after the war. But the imperialist powers of France and Britain completely rejected all these appeals. The Soviets tried until 1949 to form an alliance against German expansion, but all of these requests fell on deaf ears. In order to delay as much as possible the war with Germany, the Soviet Union had to sign the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact just to buy a little bit more time. And the Soviets knew that the Germans undoubtedly would try to use the Baltics as a staging operation against the Soviet Union, just like they did 20 years prior, in 1918 and 1919. So that is why they approached the Baltics and offered them a security agreement in exchange for trade. So that one, the Soviet Union could eliminate a potential German bridgehead, and two, this would severely weaken the Baltic fascist regimes because these pacts, they could no longer be aggressive or hostile towards the Soviet Union. Because until that point, effectively, the Baltics were embargoing the Soviet Union. They kind of recognized the Soviet Union, but they were incredibly hostile towards it. So there were many attacks on the Soviet diplomat, many attacks against the Soviet border, and a lot of provocations. For example, I think it was 1924-25, a Latvian diplomat was assassinated near Riga so that this attack could provoke tensions between Latvia and the Soviet Union. When the nationalists, when all these imperialists tried to portray themselves as some sort of innocent victims of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, you should direct them to France and Germany, who tried to isolate the Soviet Union, who rejected the Soviet Union, who rejected its proposals of collective security, and effectively they gave Central Europe to Hitler on a silver platter. They gave him Austria, they gave him Czechoslovakia and its industry, they gave him Spain, they gave him Poland. Even though the Allies guaranteed Polish sovereignty, they did absolutely nothing when Germany invaded, the phony war. Until 1940, the Allies did absolutely nothing to help Poland. They were hoping that Germany would eventually attack the Soviet Union and move east. Then, to counteract that obvious plan, the Soviets had to sign Molotov-Ribbentrop and buy themselves more time. They managed to get nearly 2 years worth of preparation. We don't even know if the Soviets could have prevailed against fascism if it wasn't for these 2 years that they spent gearing up, preparing, mobilizing their troops, getting their industry into shape.
Thanks for clarifying that aspect of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Of course, it's a very controversial thing that is surrounded by bajillion myths, so I appreciate that breakdown as well. So we have 1939, the war breaks out, Germany invades Poland, and because of this non-aggression pact that's signed, there's no war yet until 1941, even though both sides are preparing for this eventuality. In 1941, Germany invades the Soviet Union. So where was Latvia at this point? I think, as you mentioned, it's now become part of the Soviet Union. So then what happens next, essentially? Is it invaded as well by Nazi Germany?
I need to make a smaller introduction. I need to briefly explain how the socialist transformation was going on in the Baltics in 1940, 1941, because, again, it's very important in order to understand what happened next. After the Soviet Baltics joined the USSR, immediately socialist transformation begins. So all important industries are nationalized, are under public control. And various measures are implemented in order to strip the capitalists, in order to strip the landowners of their privileges. This process was not even. It was going really, really fast because the Baltics essentially had to catch up to the rest of the USSR because the rest of the country had 20 years of this transformation going on, of collectivization, of economic rebuilding. But the Baltics, essentially, they had about 1 year worth of time. So there was very little time. And because of that, a lot of the former landowners and factory owners, they managed to form an underground resistance against the Soviets. And because of that, the transformation process was very uneven. There was a lot of sabotage, a lot of resistance, but overall, the Baltic republics managed to rebound from the Great Depression and the economic collapse caused by World War II. So there were a lot of new factories popping up everywhere. And generally, the people were just doing all of these amazing things themselves. So they set up all these workers' committee, all these farmhand self-governing committees in order to work the land, in order to work at the factories, in order to control what they do, how they, for example, how they make something, how they sell it, et cetera, et cetera. There's a really good book by Anne Louise Strong. I'm sure you know her. And when she was traveling to Moscow in 1940, she was actually traveling through Lithuania. So it's right next to Latvia. It's south of Latvia. But the overall process was very similar. And she was amazed just how supportive people were of the revolution and just how steadfast this process was. But as we all know, it was interrupted by the German Nazi invasion. We're now getting into the topic of the Great Patriotic War. So the Baltics were invaded by the Army Group North, and they progressed very, very quickly. So they, in just a couple of weeks, they managed to take the entirety of Lithuania. Then they moved through Latvia. Then they captured Estonia. Because of that, the evacuation of vital factories, of vital assets and people was very fast and could not be completed. A lot of people, unfortunately, were left behind, and they were butchered by the Nazis and the local collaborators who popped up. So as soon as the German fascists invade, the former capitalists, hoping to regain their dominant position, they stage an uprising. They start mass murdering the communists and anyone suspect they're working with them. And a huge wave of fascist terror ensues. So there were huge pogroms. The local Baltic nationalists started mass killing people. For example, there were huge pogroms in Lithuania, in Kaunas. There was a huge pogrom where people were just mass murdered. For example, their heads were caved in with lead pipes and crowbars. People were just straight up murdered in the streets with piles of bodies everywhere. People were locked up in synagogues and warehouses, and those buildings were set on fire. A lot of the POWs, the Jews, the Roma people, and the disabled were rounded up, transported to nearby forests, and they're shot and then dumped into mass graves. It was everywhere in the Baltics. And the Holocaust here was basically unmatched. It was basically the most brutal scene of the Holocaust in World War II, because in Lithuania, more than 95% of its Jews were eliminated, the same figure for Latvia. And in Estonia, despite it doesn't have a large Jewish population, it was so brutal that by 1942, Estonia was declared Jew-free by the Nazis. So every single Jewish person was killed there. And the Baltic nationalists took it upon themselves to commit these horrific atrocities. And then they started mass murdering people in nearby regions of Belarus and Russia. So the so-called Operation Wintertaube, which translates to Winter Wonder, was especially brutal because in the eastern outskirts of Latvia, in Belarus and Russia, the local nationalists started committing horrific atrocities, such as burning the entire villages down, mass murdering people, just killing absolutely anyone who was even remotely suspected of helping the partisan movement, helping the communist resistance. So it was brutal. And despite all that, there was a fairly strong partisan resistance in Latvia. A lot of people went to the forests. A lot of people started gearing up. A lot of, for example, people who survived the Holocaust, they immediately joined the partisans, the insurgent groups in Latvia and Lithuania, and they started fighting back against the Nazis. There were a number of high-ranking assassinations of Nazi officials and generals. For example, the first high-ranking Nazi general was actually killed in Latvia by the partisans. It happened in the eastern part of Latvia. I don't remember his name. Maybe it was Kurtheim or something like that. So the partisans, led by such brave people such as Oškalns and Sudmalis, they managed to stay active throughout the war. And unfortunately, many of these comrades were captured and killed, such as Comrade Sudmalis, who tried to stage a large-scale attack on the Nazi administration in Riga. But unfortunately, he was ratted out, and he was torture-murdered in early 1944. For the most of the World War II, the Baltics were taken over by the Nazis. And actually, Riga, the capital of Latvia, was actually the last Soviet capital to be liberated. It was liberated in October of 1944. So the Nazis realizing that the Baltic was of strategic significance, they fought really hard for this territory. And it was really hard to smoke them out. By 1945, there was still a large pocket of fascist resistance in Courland, in the western part of the country, and the entire Army Group North was trapped in there. But unfortunately, this Army Group North could not completely destroyed until German surrender. Because of that, because the fascist elements were so strong, they formed their own insurgent groups, their own fighting groups. After the German surrender, a lot of these groups refused to surrender, and they continued to commit various terrorist attacks and various terrorist acts throughout the Baltic. Essentially, they had their own style of dirty war, where they attacked factories, where they attacked farm fields, where they just indiscriminately killed people. They killed people at random, including children, in order to terrorize the population and in order to destroy or cripple the Soviet authority. By 1953, at least 25,000 people were killed by fascist insurgents in Lithuania. About 4,000 people were murdered in Latvia, and about 1,000 were killed in Estonia. So it was very, very brutal. And the Soviet Union spent a lot of time just trying to destroy these fascist groups. And what is even more despicable is that all these fascists who were killing innocent people, who were killing children, who were killing women, the elderly, they are now called Forest Brothers and anti-communist insurgent groups by modern capitalist historiography, by all these academic hacks in the West. They hijacked the name from the socialist rebels during the revolution of 1905, and they're just trying to put this label onto these fascists who were still fighting the Soviet Union after World War II. By 1944-45, a lot of these local Nazi collaborators, tens of thousands of them, they fled to the West in order to avoid punishment, in order to avoid getting captured by the communists. So they fled to Germany, they fled to West Germany, they fled to Sweden, to Britain, to Canada, Australia, United States, and they set up basically their own capitalist governments in exile. There are veterans groups, all these nationalist groups, and they started publishing a lot of propaganda articles about the East, about how things were going on, about World War II. So that's why there is virtually no information in the English language that counters this prevailing nationalist rhetoric, unfortunately.
So many thoughts from what you've said. So I'll make a couple of points. Earlier, you had discussed once the Nazi Operation Barbarossa invasion occurred, the Soviet Union embarked on something that I don't think has ever been done before and hasn't been done since, in which they evacuated huge parts of their population, particularly out east, to prevent them from getting massacred by the Nazis. But they also moved factories and machinery and supplies and things like that on a grand scale. They essentially picked up factories and moved them miles and miles away so that they could still, of course, be able to produce things in this wartime period. It's one of those aspects of the Soviet Union's actions in the war that doesn't necessarily get seen as being part of its socialist planning, as part of its central planning, but it certainly was. It's a testament to the system's ability to adapt to the extreme war conditions it was facing.
Exactly, yeah, because a lot of this was moved east in order to save all these industries. A lot of people prevented the capture of these factories and productions by sabotaging them, preventing them from falling into enemy hands. And a lot of these workers who also were evacuated, who moved east to cities such as Sverdlovsk, Novosibirsk, Omsk, etc. Eventually, all these people joined all these partisan movements, joined the frontline divisions, and fought very bravely against the Nazis. For example, one of the biggest partisan heroes and frontline heroes were actually these former factory workers. And as soon as the news of the Holocaust, of these horrific atrocities and mass murders appeared, all of these people immediately signed up and they immediately joined the Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian frontline divisions, or they managed to cross the front line and they became partisans. They became guerrillas because they knew the land very well. They had relatives, they had friends, they had connections, and that is how this partisan movement was as strong as it was. For example, the Lithuanian partisan, Marita Melnikaite. She was a factory worker. And in 1942, she joined a partisan unit and she managed to destroy several trains worth of enemy equipment. Her partisan unit managed to sabotage several factories and several transport lines. But unfortunately, she was discovered and captured, and just like the rest of the partisans, she was brutally tortured. But she refused to give away any names. She remained defiant, she remained silent, and then she was killed by the Nazis. And there were many monuments and many streets in Lithuania named after her. And unfortunately, after the counter-revolutions of 1990, 1991, most of these monuments and street plaques were completely removed. A lot of people in Lithuania don't even know who she was. So in Latvia and Estonia, there's a similar process where all these places and monuments in honor of all these anti-Nazi fighters there are removed. So we have a lot of historical revisionism, a lot of distortions in order to vilify the Soviet Union. And what it leads to, it basically leads to a Nazi apologia. Like you see, for example, on these photos with the Baltic neo-Nazis, where all these SS veteran marches that are taking place in Riga in Estonia. You can literally search up March 16 Latvia SS parade, and you'll find all these fascists just marching freely through the heart of Riga. And this is so heartbreaking, but it actually shows everyone, it should prove to everyone what we're standing up against here.
Definitely. The utilization of Western countries, of these insurgent groups you've talked about, has been incredibly successful in its anti-communist purpose. So you mentioned the insurgents that remained after World War II.
Yeah, a lot of them. Because, the Germans left valuable intel. They left supplies for these nationalist groups, huge weapons caches in Kurland and elsewhere. And that's why it lasted for so long, unfortunately, until the mid-1950s, the armed, the bloody phase of this struggle. So the class struggle, it was going on before World War II, during World War II, and even after World War II. But even if the thing seemingly stabilized, the situation was far from good, and I will get into that later. So later we will discuss the failures of the Baltic communist revolutions. So what went wrong? How could we let this happen? How it happened? And what should we need to do to rectify all of these things that unfortunately transpired in the 1980s, 1990s?
To add to that, those insurgent groups, of course, many of them were former collaborators, but many of them were also supported in different ways by Western countries, by the CIA,
exactly.
by Britain, etc., West Germany, and the many people the insurgents that stayed, of course, and there's many people who were collaborators with the Nazis who fled to other Western countries. You mentioned West Germany, Sweden, Canada, the US, etc. And then these different communities in their new homes, they, as you mentioned, they were then used essentially as anti-communist mouthpieces to control the narrative.
Yeah, the media, the academia, yes, exactly. And it is very, very similar to what happened to all these Ukrainian Nazis that were admitted in Canada, in the US. It's the exact same process. After the Nazis were defeated, all these members of these extermination groups, all these nationalist gangs, they were immediately recruited by the West to be used as anti-Soviet proxies. And the same as it happened with the Ukrainian nationalists and fascists, a similar process occurred with the Baltics. For example, a lot of these current Baltic politicians, they were either born in the West, they either fled to the West, or they were descendants of these nationalists and those reactionaries who fled to the West. For example, our former prime minister, who's now the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Krišjānis Kariņš, he wasn't even born in Latvia. He was born in, I think, Pennsylvania or Maryland. A lot of them, after 1990, 1991, they returned. They privatized all of this public land, all of these public assets that their families previously owned. And because of that, many people, many working people were thrown into the street. Many, for example, organizations are forced to pay rent to these people who privatized all of this previous public land. And speaking of academia, this is the exact reason why it is so hard, excruciatingly hard, to find any reliable information or any detailed information about the Baltics in the English language, because a lot of this was carefully curated and it was carefully checked by the nationalists in order to enforce this notion that all these savage communists just destroyed our paradise on earth in 1940. It was hellish, it was hell on earth. That is why they tried to exaggerate all these negative things about the communists, and they omit almost every piece of information that is related to the class struggle, that is related to the economic hardships of the people, how the regular people live. Their viewpoint is very similar to the Southern lost causers in the U.S. It's the same thing that the Confederate States or the Baltics, it was just this paradise on earth. It was so beautiful, it was so pretty, but then these Northerners, these Soviets, they just came in and ruined absolutely everything. So this is the exact same of reactionary ideology. It's a different time, but the basis, the underlying reasoning for that is the same, because the Baltic nationalists were not expected to get overthrown. They were not expecting the people to be so active, to be so militant, to be so organized. And because of that, they started fighting with 10 times the force. Like Lenin wrote, the ruling classes, the oppressive classes, they do not expect to get overthrown. And once they do get overthrown, they start fighting against you with 10 times the ferocity. And it is the same thing here. So because the nationalists lost their bottom line, because they lost all of their economic and political domination, their private property, most importantly, their domination over the society, that is why they try to vilify the Soviet Union so much. So that is why they try to portray itself as some sort of evil of unprecedented proportions that is comparable to Nazi Germany. So this huge smear campaign is designed, A, to legitimize the oppressive nationalist Baltic governments, and B, to act as a stick to be used to suppress and to crush the labor union, the socialist movement. Because as soon as you start opposing all these economic injustices, this capitalist hyper-exploitation, you're immediately branded as a Kremlin agent, as a Soviet genocide apologist, as a scary red-brown Nazi, and et cetera, et cetera. And this thing even has a separate name. It's called the double genocide theory. So what the Eastern European nationalists do in Ukraine and Poland, in the Baltics, they try to equate the Nazis with the Soviet Union. So basically, they're engaging in just unprecedented historical revisionism, and essentially they do soft Holocaust denial. They're using that. They're trying to eclipse their own atrocities committed with the help of the Nazis by trying to, paint them as a lesser evil compared to the hellish Soviet communism. So that's what they're doing. They were trying to do that in the 1950s in all these study groups and all these exile groups in the West. In the 1980s, when Reagan and Thatcher came along, all of these cliches, all of these McCarthy's cliches, they were unearthed, and they were again used as an ideological weapon against communism. And if you look at China, what they're doing with China, they're trying to genocide the Tibetan culture, that they're repressing the Uyghurs, that Kim Jong-un is shelling someone or eating someone for breakfast. It is the same kind of tactic. It's just pure, black, unadulterated atrocity propaganda.
To close up our points here, one, we talked about insurgents in the Baltics, fighting the Soviets and the Soviet people. Then we have the people who fled, collaborators who fled to the West, who work as propaganda mouthpieces. And then there's one final, major role they played in this anti-communist project, and that was disrupting these ethnic communities, left-leaning or labor organizing in these Western countries. So, say, for example, in Canada, that definitely happened with the Ukrainian collaborators that fled to Canada. Prior to World War II, Canada was home to many Ukrainian immigrants who had fled Ukraine either before the Tsar fell or even during the Civil War period. So many of them already had these left-leaning values and were organized in terms of labor. But when these people, collaborators now came into Canada, they were specifically pushed in that direction to essentially dismantle these ethnic organizations.
Yeah, that's a very important part, because as you know how it happened with the Ukrainian diaspora. So So, as you know, the Ukrainian immigrant community, the Ukrainian labor community was exceptionally strong, and the Canadian Communist Party even had a separate language section for its Ukrainian members, and they fought side by side with the English-speaking Canadians, with the French Canadians, and it was really, really strong. And after World War II, when the Canadian reactionary government started letting in all these tens of thousands of Nazi collaborators, of these fascists, as you already told, they started infiltrating these immigrant communities from within, and they started to gradually shifting the focus. They tried, moving these goalposts, so to speak, and eventually, unfortunately, the Canadian community was basically taken over by the nationalists, and they turned to these rabid anti-communist and vehemently racist propaganda campaigns. And despite the fact that the Baltic immigrant communities were not too large in the United States and Canada, they certainly did exist in major cities, but simply due to the sheer size of the Baltics, they were not too large. But the same process happened with the Baltics. So on the American Eastern Seaboard, in Toronto and cities like Montreal and the West, a similar thing happened to the Baltic immigrant communities that existed there since the 19th century, when people started pouring in from the Imperial Russia. So the same process happened there. And because of that, all these cultural facilities, all these cultural events, the book publishing, it was taken over by the nationalists. And I read some of that exile press, and it is unbelievably racist. It's just plain vitriolic. For example, they were writing things such as, all these Slavic, Belarusian, Ukrainian, and Russian hordes are arriving en masse to Latvia in order to dilute the pure Latvian blood. This is what they were writing in their books and their journals verbatim. So a lot of them, under the guise of these cultural exchange missions, started traveling back to the Baltics in the late 1980s in order to do this covert propaganda work among the population, in order to do this anti-communist propaganda, in order to try to convince the people that, no, the Soviets are very evil, authoritarian, but if we build this very progressive and pure democratic socialist system, then definitely things will improve. And all of these agents, effectively, they were closely related to all these Western non-governmental organizations, so to speak. So the National Endowment of Democracy, the Einstein Institute, etc. For example, the top Latvian and Lithuanian politicians were actually in close contact and were supervised by Gene Sharp. You've probably heard of him. He's the architect of the so-called Color Revolution template, how to overthrow the anti-imperialist or simply opposing government. And Gene Sharp was actually in the Baltics a few times, and he curated all these Baltic nationalists that eventually staged the anti-communist revolution in the Baltics and took over. And they used all these similar methods of covert and overt tactics in order to overthrow the socialist authority. But we'll get into that a little bit later, because the anti-communist counter-revolution of 1990, 1991, it requires a separate topic of its own.